Hello, welcome back. We're starting our advanced sculpture class. And one of the things I really encourage my students to do in all of my advanced classes is to play and experiment with their materials, see what they can do, explore the possibilities, and learn from those experiences. In our advanced sculpture class, we start that off by doing a series of pieces in which we experiment and play with surfaces and experiment and play with glazes. You're going to make 10, I'm going to call tiles, 10 tiles in which we experiment with the surface and we experiment with glazing just to learn more about what's possible. So as we work on more of our finished pieces, we can utilize those experiments to enhance the surfaces and to enhance the glazed structures on those surfaces. I hope you guys enjoy this unit. I hope you learn a ton from it, and I encourage you to really play around and see what happens. Have some fun with your art. Here are some examples of the glaze experimentation we're going to do. There's graffito in here, this is a stencil, this is a rolled texture, wax resist. This is just seeing how our glazes function within the texture of an object. Here is our plan. We are going to make different tiles to practice these clay techniques on. And when I say tiles, you've got really three kind of options. Option number one is to make basically a coaster that you would set a drink on. And all of my pieces that I'm making today are going to be kind of smaller coasters, just so I can keep similar sizes. Last year I made a lot of pendants and magnets. If you're making pendants, you don't want to get much bigger than this or this, and you don't want to get any smaller than this guy. You can also make magnets, which would probably be about the same size as a pendant. I have little magnets that we'd glue onto the back of your piece. So magnets, pendants, or coasters. You are going to make 5 tiles. I'm going to call them tiles, okay? So a reminder, the tile might be a coaster, a pendant, or a magnet. You're going to make 5 tiles that are flat or smooth, and we're going to try the following techniques on them: a wax resist, a sgraffito, a stencil, a sponge, and an experimental glaze technique. Then you're going to make 5 tiles that have textures, one with a stamped texture, a rolled texture, carved, multiple additives, and an experimental. We're going to start by making our 5 flat or smooth tiles. So I've already rolled my slabs and I've cut my tiles. I used a very fancy tile cutter. This is just the cardboard from the inside of masking tape. If you are at home and you have a larger cookie cutter, you could use that, or you can just have any shape and cut it out. And again, if you're doing pendants or magnets, I think it's a lot more fun if you make different shapes. So play around with different shapes. If you're unsure how to roll a slab, check out the beginning of this video. Once I have my slabs cut, I just want to make sure that I have a nice, smooth, finished tile. 4 of these will go back into the kiln room to dry, and the 5th one we're going to work on with some underglaze before we dry it out. Right now I don't have the cleanest edge, so I'm just going to use my finger and clean it up. My tiles are still pretty wet. In an ideal world, which we don't live in, by the way, but in an ideal world, I'd let these set up a bit. Leather hard, they hold their shape better that way and I won't get fingerprints on them. But I'm just gonna use my fingers to smooth out my edges. I don't want any rough edges. I don't want any what will become sharp edges once it has dried. Take your time and smooth out all 4 of your tiles with fingers and sponges. So this is what I'm looking for on these smooth ones. You've smoothed the top, you've smoothed the bottom, slightly rounded the edges so you don't have any sharp corners, and smooth those edges. Then what you want to do is let these dry nice and slowly. So if you're at home, you're going to put this on a flat surface and you're going to drape it with some plastic and just let a little bit of air in there so they dry slow. If you dry them quickly, they'll kind of curl up on you, and then you won't have a nice flat tile, a coaster, pendant, magnet, etc. 4 of these you want to let dry, and we're going to fire them, and then we're going to be doing glaze techniques on this smooth surface. The 5th one, you need to underglaze to do a technique called sgraffito. And I'm gonna do my underglazing in between doing some of my more textured tiles. The thing that you want to make sure you do before you set these to dry and before you do any underglaze, and again, this works better when it's a little bit on the dry side, I want you on the back of your pieces to put your initials so that in my classroom, I know whose piece is whose. I want to pick a color that has high contrast. This clay that we're using right now fires to white, so I'm going to use black. Black will give a nice contrast. On this piece that I did sgraffito on before, I was using red clay, so I used a turquoise underglaze to have contrast. First coat of underglaze, I would start with your edges, and then you want to do your top, and you're going to let that set up for a while, and then once that's set up, you'll do a second coat and potentially even a third. When you get to the top of the tile, make sure you load your brush up with plenty of underglaze and brush all in one direction. Once you're done, set the tile aside for about a half an hour to an hour, and then you can apply the next coat. While we wait for that first layer of underglaze to set, we're going to start working on our textured tiles. And again, the reason that we're texturing these is just to kind of see how glaze interacts with textures in different ways, and just learn some different routes for surface manipulation on our clay work. The first technique I want to show you is a pretty simple one. It is stamping. The first thing you're going to want to do is smooth out your tile. So we'll do the same route we did on our flat pieces. Smooth the bases of all your textural tiles before you begin the texture. At this point, we're going to choose a stamp. So at school, we have lots of different options. And these might be things that you have lying around your house. And if you don't, there's other options. We have wooden clay stamps that have different patterns in the ends. We have small ones. We have larger ones. We have tools like this little guy that could also be used with paint that you can stamp into the clay and create an all-over texture. You can also use things like this at home. Anything that's got a hard enough surface, if you push it into the clay, is going to leave that pattern behind. So I could take these beads and I could press it into the clay, that's stamping. I could use the bottom of a shoe and press it down and stamp a texture or a design into clay. So if you're at home and doing this, look around the house. Gather a whole bunch of stuff that you could use to press a design into your clay and play around and see what works. I've also had students in the past make their own stamps. So these are two examples. You just make a flat piece of clay and you either add clay to it, like you see in both of these are additive stamps, or you can carve clay away. And then you attach a handle. Here, this one's just a long handle, and then you fire it so it's hard, and then you can use that to press things into clay. I also have things like this. These are letter stamps that you can purchase. If you've got stamps like you would use to do stamping, like in a craft sense of stamping, you can use those stamps to press textures into your clay. There's a ton of different options. I'm going to pick some of these wooden stamps, and I'm going to use these to press into my clay. You're going to see me mess up in a minute. If you make a mistake with stamping, just smooth it out and start all over. I just added more texture with the back of my fingernail. At this point with a stamped piece, what I would do is just make sure that the back of the piece is cleaned up nicely. I would sign my initials and then move on to the next piece. The next texture that I want to show you is a rolled texture. For my rolled texture, I'm going to take anything with a fine texture. So doilies, these little things, you can find them at Goodwill's and St. Vinny's. Any kind of thready object like this, or any kind of material that has like a heavier texture. Even lace will work, and honestly lace is really pretty as a clay texture. You got to pick the right glaze for it so you don't lose that texture in it. I've used leaves that have a tighter or like a heavier vein structure. Those work really well for a rolled texture. Once I've laid out where I want to have my piece, I'm going to go in and I'm going to use anything with a round shape. It could be a rolling pin. In this case, I'm just going to use one of the clay tools I happen to have in my kit, and I'm just going to roll, and I want to push those threads in this case, or if I was doing a leaf, the leaf itself, I want to push it down into the clay. Once I've rolled that down into the clay, when I remove the piece, the texture stays behind. At this point, with a piece like this, I would smooth the edges and I'd write my initials on the back. The other thing you're going to want to do is when you roll it, it squishes your piece out, so you might need to trim your edges again. For my next texture, I'm going to do a carved texture. So I'm going to do some subtractive work, and I'm going to carve a poppy into this piece. I've already smoothed out the back, I smoothed out the sides, and then I'm going to draw in the line work for what I want to carve around. I would like you to spend a little bit more time on this piece and really take your time and see what you can carve in to a piece. I really want you to play with this idea of subtractive work to build textures and interest in a piece. I'm working with a reference image so that I make sure that I am, fairly true to the form of a poppy. There's my basic poppy shape. And then what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to carve away the clay around these petals, which will set my poppy up a little bit higher than the clay around it. I'm using a sgraffito tool to do this job, and you might notice that as I'm carving away, I'm deeper where the petal meets the background, and as it moves away from the flower, my carving is less deep. I also have tiles that are only about a 1/4 inch in depth, so I don't want to carve too deep on this. This is going to be a low relief or a bas relief carving. Bas is a low relief, B-A-S, bas relief. I'm going to taper that in so it doesn't look like I just outlined this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into these petal structures, and anytime a petal goes behind another petal, I'm going to carve down again. So I'm carving what goes behind what to try to separate the planes of the piece. And then again, I'm tapering out where I've carved things so it doesn't look like I just did an outline. Once I've separated all the petals by height, I go in and I carve into each petal, defining the form more. This is where my camera ran out of storage and I didn't realize it. After I shaped each petal in the center of the flower, I went in with the back of one of my wooden clay tools and I added texture to each of the petals. And then I used the edge of that tool to have more of a ruffled edge on the very edge of the petals. Adding details like this adds so much to a piece. Take your time to add textures and subtle details in your work. At this point, I've varied the planes. So plane is a flat surface so that the planes have some undulations. They get deeper and higher. There's textures on them. There's variations. I've added texture and details. And what I would go and do now is I'm going to go in and I'm going to clean up this background. I'm going to smooth it out or add a texture to it. I'm going to smooth out my background because my poppy is so textured. I want my background to be smooth so there's some textural contrast. If your object that you do your bas relief carving with, if your object is really smooth, then I would highly suggest texturizing your background so that you have that contrast there. The other thing I'm doing when I'm smoothing out my background, and if I was adding texture, I'd do the same thing, I'm doing a little bit of an undercut on my petals. So I'm using this tool to push underneath the petal just a little bit, which creates a little shadow underneath it, and it brings out that edge. It also cleans up my edges a little bit, so I'm going to go around and do that to the whole piece. Make sure your backgrounds are as well cared for as your foregrounds on your work. Then the last step in your carving is to clean up the bas relief itself. So I'm going to use a variety of different tools to go in and do some undercutting on my edges of the petals so all these petals appear separate from each other. I'll clean up the textures at that point. And then I am done, ready to set this aside to dry. So again, undercutting, cleaning up, making sure I have nice edges and variations, good textures, and some variations in the levels of my surface planes. Take your time on these carved pieces. Pick something to carve that you can add a lot of details to, textures and variations in the surface. Make it a piece you're really proud of. This is a great technique to add to your repertoire. At this point, this piece is ready to dry. There's some little clay gumblies that I'll have to get off once it's dried up. I'm going to clean up the back. I will sign my name on it, and then I'm going to work on my sgraffito piece. So I've been working on my other textural pieces now for about an hour, and my first layer of the underglaze on the tile that I will sgraffito is set up enough. Brush the second layer on in the opposite direction to the first, and don't be afraid to lay that on a little thick. All right, I've got 3 of my textured pieces done, my stamped, my rolled, and my carved texture. The next one that I'm going to work on is doing some additive work, and specifically working with multiples. So I'm going to smooth off my tile and get it prepped and ready to work on. All right, I cleaned off the back, I smoothed it out, and now what I'm going to do is work on adding some multiples to this to create some texture, and I'm going to use one of my favorite routes. So I've rolled some spheres, and I'm going to score the surface of my piece because I'm going to put textures on the entire surface of this, and I would like you to do the same when you do your piece. Okay, and I've added slip to the surface. You want quite a bit of slip. I'm going to put those circles down, and I'm just going to press a little bit. Once I had the circles down, I used the back of a pencil to indent the center of each circle, and then I used the tip of a pencil to add a hole in the center of each one. I tried to vary the sizes of the circle, and I left a small area in between the left side and the right side that was open. I thought it'd be fun to use a different technique in that area just to provide a little variation. So I rolled out coils, tapered it at the end, split them in the middle, and then I laid them into a pretty thick slip bed. I thought it added a little bit of fun to the piece. I pushed the tips down too so they didn't get broken off when somebody uses this as a coaster. I'd like you on your additive piece where you're working with putting in multiples, you pick a shape or a form, try to pick something relatively simple, and then you're just going to repeat it over and over and over again and lay it into the slip. This is a form of additive sculpture, additive texture, and if you can imagine, this kind of practice would make some great textures on wheel thrown pieces. If you're doing sculptural pieces, think about all the different objects that textures like this could be great for. So just think about how doing a technique like this, or the carved technique like I did with the poppy, or any of the textures can enhance all the work that we do with sculpture. Play around with different techniques, play around with different textures and adding pieces in different ways. This kind of detail work takes a piece from, oh, that's nice, to like, oh, that's so cool, I can't stay away from touching it. Like, you want to make art that people want to touch, right? But then they don't, and they don't break it. Unless it's functional, then you can touch it. But you want to make art that people want to interact with. You want to be that artist at a museum or a show where people are like, oh, I wish I could touch that piece. I want to know what it feels like. We've all had those reactions to art, and that's a great reaction to give your viewer, to want to interact more with your work. So play around with these textures, play around with the additive work on it, and see what you can come up with. Your last textural tile is an experimental piece. So this tile you can do whatever you want with as long as you're making a texture on it. So think about what might be interesting. Maybe you really enjoyed doing this additive work and you want to do another one that's additive. Maybe you loved carving and you want to do one that's another carved texture. Maybe you want to combine additive and carving on one piece and see how that looks and works for you. Maybe you want to do some stamped. Maybe you want to play with something we haven't played with. Maybe you just have an idea you want to try out. We just want to make sure there's texture or variations in the surface that when we go to glaze this after these have been fired, that glaze is going to interact in those textures in different ways, and we can really play around and experiment with those glazes and how we layer them in different ways. Have fun with it, my friends. It's a really great technique. Here are our 5 textural pieces: stamped, rolled, subtractive carving, and additive with multiples. The 5th one is up to you to play with and create whatever you would like. Once you're done with these 5, I want you to just double check that the back is clean. This one isn't. I'm going to clean it off again. Make sure that your initials are on the back of each one, and then you're going to slowly dry these out. So place them somewhere safe, drape plastic over the top, and let them dry slowly. Our next step is firing these pieces. The last thing I want to do with you guys before I send you away is we're going to put one more coat of underglaze on our sgraffito piece. Then what I'm going to do is set my smooth tiles back, draped with plastic, to start to slowly dry for about a day. Then I'm going to come back after a day or so, a day or two, and I'm going to do the sgraffito work on the top of this piece. Really important to do the sgraffito that the clay is at the right consistency. You want it to be what we call leather hard. Leather hard is like a piece of rawhide leather. The type of leather that you would make, I don't know, a shoe out of, a heavy boot, not the type of leather you'd have on clothing. You want it to have a little bit of stiffness to it, and that's when it's ready to do the carving work of sgraffito. I make my next video in this series on sgraffito work. Once all our tiles are fired, we'll come back in and talk about the work of glazing. Make sure that these smooth tiles all have your name on the back, and the front, backs, and sides are in a nice, smooth state. You also want to make sure that the sgraffito tile doesn't dry out too much before the next step, so keep an eye on the texture of your work.